Hello, Internet. Evan Benton of Dogg for Mayor here. I'm going to try a new thing on my channel where I review books. I'm going to call it a book report because I'm not going to say whether a book is good or not. I'm only going to review books that I think are important and that advance the discussion about history, etc., and our understanding thereof. So I picked a doozy to begin with, and I'm not going to do it justice, but at least hopefully it'll be an entertaining presentation for y'all. So the book I'm starting with is called Béchamp or Pasteur, a lost chapter in biology. And it's actually two books. The first one is that book by Ethel Douglas Hume, written in 1923. And the second is called Pasteur, Plagiarist Imposter, written by R.B. Pearson in 1942. And I wasn't actually able to find his full name, so that's all you have. And this book I have it in PDF form, so I don't have an actual text copy to hold up or read from. It is copyright Béchamp.org, and so I'm not going to give you the link to the PDF, but you can probably find it. It's available on Amazon, and I will post that link down below. It's a mind-blowing book. Highly recommend it if you're into medicine or science or anything between those two extremes. So, a brief summary is that, so first of all, yes, Pasteur is, as we know, Louis Pasteur, father of microbiology, as he's called, was both a plagiarist and an imposter, which is by no means surprising. We're all used to that, the fraud of history and science and blah, blah, blah. But what's really crazy is that this other guy, Antoine Béchamp, who I maybe had heard of, but anyway, in addition to doing everything that Pasteur did, according to this book, before Pasteur, he also created a whole new theory of biology, or of the organization of life. So he claimed in his work and in his experiments that the fundamental organizing unit of life, analogous to the atom in physics, so the biological atom, was not the cell, but enveloped particles he called microzyma in French, or I guess microzymes or microsomes. You can find a little bit of information on those in English, but it's pretty difficult. These particles that he discovered were barely visible under optical microscopes, and he recommends in this book at least a 360 times magnification. So because he couldn't really see them too well, he resorted to chemistry to see what effect they would have on various solutions. And he also used a spectrometer to analyze the spectrum of the light emitted by the particles or reflected by the particles, so he could tell what was the chemical makeup there. And he used a polarimeter to measure the polarity of the light. So that measures when light passes through a medium, if it reflects it or if it bends it to the right or to the left to any degree. You can detect that with a polarimeter. So it might not be immediately obvious to my viewers how significant that is, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to get into how really mind-blowing that is in this talk, because there's so much more in this book to cover. But so to begin with, what we have today is called germ theory, of course, and Louis Pasteur is credited as the quote-unquote father of that. And that's basically the idea. I'm defining it as, it's the idea that a single pathogen causes a single disease. So when someone's sick, you look for the cause of that disease, which would be one, organism, like COVID-19 is caused by the coronavirus, and you just have to find a specific medication that destroys that invader, basically. So Béchamp's theory, the microzyme theory, on the other hand, it doesn't really deal with disease solely like the way that the germ theory kind of does. But it's this idea that cells are composed of smaller particles called microzymes, and that when a cell dies, it breaks down into these microzymes, which survive, and then the microzymes can recombine into other cells or into what we call bacteria, which can then cause disease. So if you have any kind of an injury in your body and your cells are destroyed and certain conditions prevail, your cells, the microzymes that used to make up your cells, can then combine into different kinds of bacteria, and that can cause deleterious effects on your body. So as opposed to just the idea of, if someone stabs you with a knife and it brings in, like, there's a bacterium on the knife and then you get sick from that. There's this idea that if your body is not in good shape and you injure it, something inside of your body can actually turn into an infectious pathogen. So yeah, it's really like, crazy stuff. But yeah, hopefully if that piques your interest, read the book, or maybe I'll make another video about that. Alright, so as far as I can tell, all the criticism of Béchamp's work consists of claiming that he believed that bacteria from the outside world could not cause disease in an animal's body. And this claim is untrue based on this book. So, for example, in 1865, he demonstrated that single-celled parasites were the cause of the silkworm disease pébrine, and that creosote was effective in preventing it. And meanwhile, at the same time, Louis Pasteur, who was tasked officially by the French government with investigating pébrine, declared that it was a spontaneous growth akin to cancer. So the creator of germ theory didn't think that a germ was causing this disease. He thought that it was just spontaneously occurring, and he couldn't understand it. So the truth about Béchamp's theory is that it includes germs. It encompasses germ theory, but it's just a lot more sophisticated. So if someone gets sick, you have to take into consideration their environment, their diet, their habits, their genetics, all kinds of things like that. And in typical fashion, Wikipedia, when you look up Béchamp, will direct you to their page on germ theory denialists. So on the one hand, of course, we've got the germ theory. On the other hand, we've got the germ theory denialists. And it's like, you're a scientist, and none of the scientists said, hey, are you denying germ theory? And that you have to pick a side if you're going to get ahead. If you're going to be an academic, you have to pick a side, basically. And there's only one good side, of course. So that article's a lot longer than the article on Béchamp on Wikipedia, which is telling. And I'm going to read an excerpt. It's actually most of the article. So this is from Wikipedia's article on Antoine Béchamp. Denying, there you go, that bacteria could invade a healthy animal and cause disease, Béchamp claimed instead that unfavorable host and environmental conditions destabilize the host's native microzymes, whereupon they decompose host tissue by producing pathogenic bacteria. And that's just false. That's not what he says at all. But anyway, he died at the age of 91, his work having faded into scientific obscurity and Pasteur's version of germ theory dominant. Not true, but dominant. A brief obituary in the British Medical Journal noted that Béchamp's name was, quote, associated with bygone controversies as to priority, which it would be unprofitable to recall. In the modern day, Béchamp's work continues to be promoted by a small group of alternative medicine proponents, also known as germ theory denialists, including advocates of alternative theories of cancer who dismiss Pasteur's germ theory and argue that Béchamp's ideas were unjustly ignored. They accuse Pasteur, as did the French Academy of Sciences, of plagiarizing and then suppressing Béchamp's work, citing work such as Ethel Douglas Hume's Béchamp or Pasteur, which we're reading right now, from the 1920s. So, I don't know if you caught that, but they're saying in Wikipedia that the French Academy of Sciences also accused Pasteur of plagiarizing Béchamp, and that's true. That happened. So, I don't know, how did Pasteur become the hero that he is today? Well, I'm going to try and shed some light on that. But this is one of those things where you have that meme, why can't we have both, right? So why can't we say that a germ can cause disease, and then also these other things called microzymes can cause disease as they relate to your diet and environment? You know, it's complicated. It's just, it's trying to, again, make us pick a side and boil it down into this dialectical thing, which is just, you know, it's not healthy. Ha. All right. So the two things that you hear spoken of, if you hear Béchamp spoken of at all, is just, you know, first of all, dismissal or make ad hominem attacks and reduce it to this thing of priority. Who discovered germ theory first? So that's just, it's curious to say the least. So what I find curious, though, is that nobody is disproving Béchamp's claims, at least none that I can find. So I'm going to repeat those claims just to get it all out in the open. So first of all, he found that chalk caused fermentation. 250 million year old rocks cause fermentation of a sugar water solution. But synthetic calcium carbonate, man-made calcium carbonate, which was available in those times apparently, did not. Okay? So he was studying fermentation and he was surprised by this. So he looked at the chalk under a microscope and he found tiny moving things. And then he found that these tiny moving things were agents of fermentation, which is crazy. And so the whole thing there is, you know, contamination. People are going to say that his samples were contaminated and it was really like yeasts that he found. But he's not saying it was yeast. He's saying it was, you know, very, very small things that could barely be seen. Yeasts are very large on a microscope. But, you know, that's the thing to look at, and no one is doing that. They're just dismissing him, which is, again, curious. So a little bio on these two gents, all right? 1816, Antoine Béchamp was born. 1822, Louis Pasteur was born. 1847, Pasteur received his doctorate in science from the École Normale Supérieure. And every biography of Pasteur says that he was mediocre in chemistry, they wrote that down about him. So I would be remiss to not include that. And then in the next year, 1848, Pasteur started teaching, and the same year he published a groundbreaking paper demonstrating molecular chirality for the first time. And the chirality is handedness. So a molecule can, you know, if it's like a spiral molecule, it can twist this way, or it can twist this way. And you can tell by using one of those, I just can't remember what they're called. I had trouble with it before, you remember. Polarimeter. Just to detect the polarity of the light that is shining through them. You can tell if it's twisting to the left or twisting to the right. So he did that, and that was, you know, really hit it out of the park with that one. Wikipedia notes on his page, some historians consider Pasteur's greatest work in this area, some historians consider Pasteur's work in this area to be his most profound and most original contributions to science. That was a quote. And his, quote, greatest scientific discovery. So not biology, but chirality or crystallography. 1852, Béchamp developed the Béchamp reduction, which is a process for making synthetic dyes cheaper, and so that set off the whole synthetic dye industry, which led to a lot of other stuff. You know, not as I don't know, jaw-dropping as Pasteur, but it made a lot of people a lot of money. In the next year, 1853, he received his doctorate in science, and then in 1856, he received a doctorate in medicine. So he was a medical doctor as well as a PhD, whereas Pasteur was just a scientist. And then in 1862, Louis Pasteur was admitted to the French Academy of Sciences based mainly on his crystallography work. And then in 1863, Louis Pasteur was assigned by Emperor Napoleon III to investigate diseases of vineyards. So that's really important. Libertarians eat your heart out because everything that Louis Pasteur did was for the government. He was basically a government official, okay? And that puts us all in a really interesting context. He was a professor, but all of his work doing this, the research that he was later to become a hero known for, he did for the French government. And that's what gave him the clout to make these crazy assertions that he would make. So the Pasteur and Béchamp first came to blows over the subject of fermentation. And brief recap of this, Béchamp started his research in 1854. He published his final paper on the subject, or his conclusive paper on the subject, in January of 1858. And then Pasteur started his work in 1857 and published his paper in April of 1858. So it was a couple months after Béchamp. Both men's experiments involved putting sugar and water into a sealed flask and observing it to see if the sugar changed. And the way that they observed is really cool. They again use that polarimeter because what's happening, it's called inversion. Inversion of sugar, you might have heard of invert sugar. So you take sucrose and then it changes from one molecule of sucrose into a molecule of glucose and fructose. And when it does that, the angle of the light changes from a right-handed bend when you shine light through the molecule to a left-handed bend. And they can tell that, and that's how they know. They can tell the average angle coming through this solution, and they know what percentage of it is sucrose and what percentage is inverted to glucose and fructose. It's very cool, and you can see how the crystallography element comes into it. Béchamp was also very skilled in that the polarimeter thingy, and that's how he was, studying. As I mentioned, he was studying his microzymes. So the issue with that was contamination. It was found that even though their flasks were sealed, they found that mold spores in just the tiny amount of air that was in the flasks could land on the surface of the sugar water solution, and then they could ferment it. And that's how they discovered that sugar water just sitting there on the shelf wouldn't do anything. You had to put an organism into it. And what they say is a controversy over priority is because these guys came out with their papers so close together. But Béchamp's was first. I mean, I don't really understand it. The problem also with Pasteur's publications is that he didn't add anything to the discussion. He didn't really explain how anything worked. It also just didn't disprove spontaneous generation. So nothing in his papers proved that there had to have something there to make that happen. So and not only that, he was still promoting spontaneous generation up until 1863. Louis Pasteur was. So the issue for Béchamp's detractors is that he didn't mention the mold in his first 1855 paper. He published a lot of papers, unlike Pasteur, and he neglected to mention it until 1858. And so the argument that they're making is that he saw one of Pasteur's preliminary papers where he did mention mold, and then he, felt like he had to put it into his final paper. But the thing is that Béchamp wrote a lot of papers on fermentation, and he spelled out the whole process. So he demonstrated experimentally not only that it was yeast, that there was a thing that was fermenting the sugar, but he showed that it was a liquid produced by the cells, an enzyme produced by the cells, not the cells themselves, that made the sugar. And it wasn't until 1897, which is 40 years later, that they finally, somebody else, I can't remember his name, it also started with a B, someone else finally figured out that there was an enzyme involved by grinding up the yeast and then squeezing them and using that and showing that, yes, that could invert sugar. Béchamp did that in 1857. So as late as 1860, Pasteur still believed that living cells and living cells alone were the agents of fermentation, thus proving that despite having published several papers on the subject, he failed to grasp the basic physiology of fermentation. And so this book, Béchamp or Pasteur, makes this point again and again, that Pasteur didn't understand what he was talking about, and he would just make baseless claims. And people would challenge his baseless claims, and he would backslide and just make other baseless claims. And they caught him doing this over and over again. And if you want to read more about that, pick up the book, and you can do so. The next big controversy was the wine controversy, which was where Pasteur was working for the government. He was sent by, as I mentioned, Napoleon III to the vineyards to see what was going on, why these wines weren't turning out, because that was a big business for France, obviously. So he started that in 1863. He was employed in full-time research. Béchamp, on the other hand, around the same time started doing that on his free time. So he was a professor, and just on evenings and weekends, he was like, I'm going to figure out what's going on here. And again, with his papers, Béchamp explained the whole process. He wrote a paper 1 year later in 1864 showing that there were organisms on the surface of the grapes that fermented the wine. And then there were other organisms on the stems and the leaves of the wine, of the grapes, that would affect the quality of the wine and make it not as good. So, again, he's not saying there's no such thing as cells. Like, that's ridiculous. He said that, not only are there cells, but there's different kinds of cells. And in 1864, and Pasteur's just, who knows, politicizing and whatnot, he identified that there's two different cells, and he said, these ones are the ones you want to get for the good wine, and these ones are the ones you don't want to get. And then in 1872, so that's 8 years later, Pasteur finally publishes a paper, New Experiments to Demonstrate that the Yeast Germ that makes wine comes from the exterior of grapes. That's the title of his paper, translated in English. So he's saying the exact same thing 8 years later. He's calling it New Experiments. All right. And then Pasteur, the outcome of that was he developed a system for sterilizing wine to get rid of the baddies by heating it or pasteurizing it, which of course we know what that is with milk. And so this is great. The book quotes another book by a Dr. Luteau. His book is Études sur l'Arrage, and he says, all who placed confidence in this process of pasteurization underwent heavy loss. Only the state persisted in heating the wines destined for the armies of land and sea. This rendered them so bad that the men preferred to drink water. Imagine. It is high time that the apparatus For heating wines, according to the Pasteur system, should be put into the melting pot. And the same is true for beer. Dr. Luteau said that after the developments of Pasteur, the French stopped brewing beer, preferring to import it from Germany. And we know to this day the French make shitty beer. And then next, the issue of silkworms. We already discussed how that happened. So after that is the vaccines, and that is where it gets really spicy. Béchamp, it goes without saying, didn't have anything to do with the vaccines because his theory renders them invalid. But Pasteur's first triumph in the vaccine industry was 1879 with chicken cholera, which he discovered entirely by accident when he went on vacation and he left an assistant in charge of his experiments, and a culture of the cholera got left out for too long, and then Pasteur came back from vacation and said, put it in the chickens anyway. True story. And lo and behold, the chickens didn't die, and then they reused the chickens for another experiment. They injected them with more cholera, and they found that again the chickens didn't die. And he took this as proof that he had created a vaccine against chicken cholera just by accident. And that just shows how lax his experimental protocols were. He discovered his first vaccine entirely by accident. He didn't know how it worked or anything. And then in 1881, he claimed to have invented an Anthrax Vaccine. It was tested in Hungary and promptly banned. It was tested in Italy and found to be completely ineffective. And then it was tested in Russia, where 3,696 out of 4,564 sheep died. That is an 81% fatality rate for Pasteur's anthrax vaccine. Dr. Luteau again noted that Pasteur was compelled to compensate many owners in France for animals killed by his vaccines, but his work went on. And then in 1885, he developed the Rabies Vaccine. And this one I'm mainly going to just read from the book for this one. So, a French researcher named Bouley has stated that out of 100 persons bitten by rabid animals and entirely untreated in any way whatever, not more than 5 would develop symptoms of hydrophobia. So, I've always been afraid of rabies. It was a much bigger thing back in 100 years ago. There were, rabies panics it mentions in this book, but that just shows that it wasn't that big of a deal. Turns out a lot of it was actually, psychological. The book A System of Surgery said, some idea may be gained of the frequency of mistakes of diagnosis in connection with canine rabies by the statement of Faber, who says that of 892 dogs brought into the Veterinary Institute of Vienna under suspicion of rabies, only 31 proved to be really effective. That's not very much. So Pasteur developed the test for rabies that we still use today, where, obviously you have to cut the dog's head off. So what they do, quote the book, involve taking some matter, saliva, blood, part of the brain or spinal cord, usually the cerebrospinal fluid, from the suspected animal and injecting it into a living rabbit. And if the rabbit went paralyzed, then they say that the dog must have had rabies. Quote, Vulpian, a French doctor and physiologist and a supporter of Pasteur himself, found that the saliva of healthy human beings killed off rabbits as quickly as the saliva of a child who had died of hydrophobia. So the same guy who's developing this stuff, or working for the guy who's developing it, working with the guy who's developing it, says it doesn't work. And this is a long time ago anyway. So Now we get to the point where he made history precisely at 8 p.m. on July 6th, 1885. Louis Pasteur inoculated 9-year-old Joseph Meister and changed medical history forever with the rabies vaccine. And I'm just going to read from Wikipedia on that. This is from the controversies section under Pasteur's article. Pasteur's experiments are often cited as against medical ethics, especially on his vaccination of Meister. He did not have any experience in medical practice, and more importantly, lacked a medical license. This is often cited as a serious threat to his professional and personal reputation. His closest partner, Émile Roux, who had medical qualifications, refused to participate in the clinical trial, likely because he considered it unjust. However, Pasteur executed vaccination of the boy under the close watch of practicing physicians Jacques-Joseph Granchet, head of the Paris Children's Hospital Pediatric Clinic, and Alfred Vulpian, the guy I mentioned, a member of the Commission on Rabies. He was not allowed to hold the syringe, although the inoculations were entirely under his supervision. It was Granchet who was responsible for the injections, and he defended Pasteur before the French National Academy of Medicine on the issue. Pasteur has also been criticized for keeping secrecy of procedure and not giving proper preclinical trials on animals. Pasteur stated that he kept his procedures secret in order to control its quality. He later disclosed his procedures to a small group of scientists. Pasteur wrote that he had successfully vaccinated 50 rabid dogs before using on Meister. According to Geisen, who more on him later, Pasteur's laboratory notebook showed that he had vaccinated only 11 dogs. Meister never showed any symptoms of rabies, but the vaccination has not been proven to be the reason. One source estimates the probability of Meister contracting rabies at 10%. Okay, and that's Wikipedia. That's not an anti-Pasteur book. And, when we cite Wikipedia, yes, we're not citing it as a trustworthy source. We're citing it as, like, the mainstream source. We know it's controlled. We know Jimmy Wales doesn't need your coffee money. It's just what we're supposed to believe. It's the mainstream source, okay? Shouldn't have to say that, but I do. So back to the book, what it had to say, quote, "We must ask what proof Pasteur had of either the madness of the dog or the probability of hydrophobia ensuing in the victim. The rabid state of the animal was inferred by its savagery and by the fact that a post-mortem examination disclosed hay, straw, and pieces of wood in the stomach. The presence of the latter would seem far more likely to indicate that the dog had been ravenous, probably starving, a condition that in itself would have accounted for its savage behavior." So there's no evidence that the boy was bit by a rabid dog. There's no evidence that he was at risk of developing rabies, and the likelihood that you would develop rabies, even if you were bit by a rabid animal, is around 5%, according to this book. Furthermore, in 1886, a doctor asked the French Academy of Medicine, quote, "Has the annual mortality from hydrophobia in France been diminished by the anti-rabies medication?" No. Does this mortality tend to augment with the intensive rabies methods? Yes. Where then is the benefit? So they found that the rabies vaccine actually caused rabies. And the book gives figures that indicate that the number of rabies deaths actually increased after the introduction of Pasteur's vaccine. 30 deaths a year to 45 deaths a year in France, 65 deaths a year to 85 deaths a year in Italy, and a whopping 10 deaths a year to 72 deaths a year in India. And then there's a section in the book that shows just that way back in the 19th century, proponents of vaccination were using the same techniques to fudge the numbers that we hear them doing today. And I'm going to read that. Quote, "Pasteur carefully screened his statistics, after some untoward deaths had occurred during treatment or immediately after, by ruling that all deaths should be excluded from the statistical returns which occurred either during treatment or within 15 days of the last injection. It is in accordance with this most extraordinary rule that the percentage of deaths in all Pasteur institutes works out as such a low figure. Thus, in the report on the Kasauli Institute for 1910, Major Harvey commences his comments on the statistics of the year as follows. In this year, 2,073 persons bitten or licked by rabid or suspected rabid animals were treated, yielding a percentage of failures of 0.19. This percentage, Major Harvey explains in these words. There were 26 deaths from hydrophobia. Of these, 14 died during the treatment. 8 died within 15 days of completion of treatment, and 4 later than 15 days after completion of treatment. Only the last 4 are counted as failures of the treatment according to Pasteur's definition of a failure, and it is on this number that the percentage failure rate is calculated. So that's just another reason this book is really interesting to read, is that we see the same objections to vaccines being raised 100 years ago, and vaccine proponents just still have not addressed them. And similarly, as with today, the motivation for Pasteur's vaccine craze in the 19th century seems to have been monetary. And I'm sure there's a lot of connections to be drawn between him and the pharmaceutical companies of his day, like Bayer and BASF, which are still around. But actually, he cut out the middleman in 1888 by forming his own Pasteur Institute in Paris. And the aim of the Pasteur Institute was to produce vaccines and to produce pro-vaccine science, but also to vaccinate people, to administer and distribute vaccines. So obviously a conflict of interest there by modern considerations. But despite that, new franchises of the Pasteur Institute soon opened up all around the world, and they're on every continent except Antarctica, I'm sure. There's a lot of them. And the Pasteur Institute has been at the forefront of medical research ever since. They produced 10 Nobel laureates. They studied all these diseases. They're the first research institute to isolate the HIV virus in 1983, and on and on and on. Interestingly, it says in Wikipedia that in the 1970s they ran into financial trouble due to, quote, decadence. I don't know what that means, but that sounds pretty interesting. So there's one little thing I had to say from the Wikipedia article on the Pasteur Institute. This is a quote. During the First World War, the Institute was not only involved in the prevention of sanitary risks, but also had to deal with the demands of the moment. The most urgent matter was to vaccinate the troops against typhoid fever, easily contracted by the soldiers who often had no choice but to drink from small streams or puddles from the last rain. And I had to mention that because it's just so telling of this mentality. It's not the most urgent matter was to vaccinate the troops. Does that sound familiar? Because of a disease they got because they didn't have access to healthy water. So the most urgent matter is not to get them water or to clean the water they have available. It's to vaccinate them. It makes no sense, but that's what we're dealing with. So I'm going to finish up Pasteur's little section with some more controversies from his Wikipedia article. Quoting again, a French national hero at age 55. In 1878, Pasteur discreetly told his family never to reveal his laboratory notebooks to anyone. His family obeyed, and all his documents were held and inherited in secrecy. Finally, in 1964, Pasteur's grandson and last surviving male descendant, Pasteur Valéry Rallo, donated the papers to the French National Library, Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Yet the papers were restricted for historical studies until the death of Valéry Radeau in 1971. The documents were given a catalog number only in 1985. In 1995, the centennial of the death of Louis Pasteur, a historian of science, Gerald L. Gayson, I mentioned him earlier in the other part of the Wikipedia article, published an analysis of Pasteur's private notebooks in his book called The Private Science of Louis Pasteur, and declared that Pasteur had given several misleading accounts and played deceptions in his most important discoveries. So that's not from this book, that's from Wikipedia, okay? And that book is available, but it's out of print and it's expensive. It's like $80. If anyone wants to send that to me, that'd be radical. But it's another one of these books that just, it's not a banned book per se. It's just hard to find, you know? So this is where I want to talk about Béchamp, but we're at 40 minutes already, and kind of just going to leave that, all right? So I'm just going to go on to what happened. Because obviously, you know, how did Pasteur become this hero, and how did Béchamp's ideas just fall by the wayside? So mainly, Pasteur had the backing of the state. He had the backing of major commercial interests, which were producing these vaccines, and already in the 1870s and 80s making tons of money off of them. And then another big thing was the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. And I happen to know a little bit about this war, from this book, The Arms of Krupp. The Krupp family they were steel magnates in Germany, and they developed the first economically viable process for creating large amounts of steel. And so using that steel, they created artillery. And this artillery was what let the Germans win the Franco-Prussian War. And it's super interesting if you're into that kind of stuff. But so basically, from this book, what it says is that when they had the cannons before that were brass, so they didn't shoot as far, they weren't as damaging. So what they would do in combat is they would shoot them at the enemy, they would bombard them with artillery, and then they would take a break, and then the infantry and cavalry would come up and finish off the rest of the troops after the enemy had been softened up. And in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, they said that after their initial artillery barrage, there was nothing left of the enemy. It was just pink mist, and it just took all the fun out of warfare. But that was the Franco-Prussian War. It was huge. That was what led to the unification of Germany, which is super interesting. You know, Germany came out of war, literally. You know, so that just tells you a lot about how World War I and World War II came about, and it also led to the domination of Germany, the German people, by the Prussians, who had some super kinky stuff going on. But as a result of that war, Béchamp lost voluntarily he vacated his appointment as a professor in Montpellier, where he had worked for his whole career, and that's where he had all of his successes, you know. And as a measure of patriotic goodwill, he went to Lille to participate in the founding of a new university, which was backed by the Catholic Church, which is big in France, everyone knows. So, you know, he took a big gamble just basically out of patriotism, according to this book. And when he he thought it would be so because he was a renowned professor, so it was just kind of a thing of, oh well, if Béchamp's here, that'll bring in some good students. But from the get go, the faculty there was very opposed to his research and his microzyme theory, and they even tried to have his book Les Microzymes placed on the Vatican's list of banned books. They weren't successful, but his career was ruined, and he retired basically, and he moved to France, where he stopped being a professor. He still did research, but he stopped teaching students. So, and the thing is that I learned from, again, just from Wikipedia, it's not in this book, but that college that he ended up working at, Louis Pasteur had actually been the dean of the School of Chemistry, or the College of Chemistry there. He wasn't, at that time, they weren't the same college, but they are now the same college of the College of, or the University of Lille, if you look that up. So, they weren't the same at the time, but they've become the same now. And it was it's a small, city. And I just wonder if Pasteur hadn't just set a trap for Béchamp to walk into. But I think that's what happened. So I'm going to close my reading of the book with a speech that's reproduced in here that was given in the House of Lords on February 2nd, 1942, and this refers to the Franco-Prussian War. Lord Portsmouth moved the motion in the absence through illness of Lord Teviot. Lord Glentanner and Lord Hankey supported the motion, as did Lord Geddes. Lord Geddes referred to the controversy regarding the food required and the use of chemical fertilizers. He said it goes back for nearly a century and has been made a very difficult controversy to follow by the dominance for so many years of the German school of biology. The German school, Virchow, Schwann, Liebig, I must be German, laid the emphasis upon the cell, out of which in their millions our bodies are created, and they regarded food for the cell as all that was required. Apart from that, and really obliterated and eclipsed by the German school, very likely as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, and the prestige the Germans got through the war, there was a French school of which Professor Béchamp was the leader, working at Montpellier in the 50s of the last century. This school had a quite different idea about the structure of the vitality and vigor of the body. And I think it was a great pity that as a result of the Franco-Prussian War and various things that followed it in the 1870s, a great deal of the work of Professor Béchamp was entirely ignored and overlooked. Lord Geddes then described the great contribution Professor Béchamp made, a contribution his lordship had been familiar with for over 30 years, to the whole idea of life, namely that the cell is not the fundamental unit of life, but that there is a much smaller, more minute unit of life, which he called in his later reports to the Academy of Science, the microzymes, but which in his early reports he always referred to as the little bodies. Lord Geddes showed how these little living bodies have the power of organizing life, and suggested that as they are not present in artificial chemical manures, the German school, which we have in this country largely followed in biology for many years, overlooked something of great importance, something which may be necessary for our human bodies, if they are to maintain their full vitality by receiving in their food a continuous supply of the living little bodies. Lord Geddes emphasized that there is a real divergence of opinion between the two schools which have existed for a long time, one of which has become dominant and out of whose practice and beliefs the whole of the chemical industry has arisen and has been able to show results of the most remarkable kind in boosting production in the plant's growth and those portions of the food that are required as fuels. But he suggested that the composters had got hold of the real source of vitality. The little bodies could be seen in drops of blood under a microscope, and during the course of that week he had examined a great many, and he had seen most extraordinary differences between people fed in different ways and in different states of health. He proposed that the research that was needed was investigation of the question, is the supply of these little living bodies in the food essential to the continued vitality of human beings, or is it not? He thought there was the possibility, many think the extreme probability, that the presence of these little living bodies in the food is essential to health. He went on to describe how these little living bodies are found in the most antique remnants of life, and how they can start organization in a sugar solution that is sterile and dead, and concluded by saying that the problem could best be answered with a combination of research by the Agricultural Research Council and of observation carefully conducted and carefully, oh dang it, that's the wrong, I don't know. Modern confirmations of, yeah, okay. That's the end of that. That's the end of that quote. I screwed it up. Sorry, I cut it off somehow. Anyway, that's what they were talking about in the House of Lords in 1944, and of course the British were at war with Germany then, and they were allied with what was left of France at that point. So that's going to play into it. But again, it's just, this book is like a time capsule, just looking back into what they're saying about vaccines for one thing, and just biology in general in those times, and it's just super, super interesting. And I plan to go on and read as much of Béchamp as I can at this point. Most of it's in French. You heard me try to speak French, but I'm going to work on it. So my thing is basically, at some point, science diverged onto these two separate paths. There's the covert path, and then there's the overt path. There's the stuff that everybody knows about, that we're allowed to know about. And this book is just an invaluable resource into kind of giving us an idea when those two paths diverged. Looking back now at 1857 is one of the key dates, and the development of germ theory by these two gentlemen. So, of course, the other part of the book is just the many implications of Béchamp's theories, and I'd love to get into that, but we're running long here. So if that does pique your interest, drop a comment, and I'd love to talk about it. But as it stands, highly recommend this book to you. And I'd like to keep doing these book reports because I had a lot of fun. Well, this one was really, really hard. I spent a long time putting this together. But I'm done, and now I'm going to go take a nap. So that's it for me. That's it for Béchamp or Pasteur, a lost chapter in the history of biology. My name is Evan Benton, and this is Dogg from Air. Like my channel, like the video, however that stuff works. Comment, share, all the things. Dogg from Air.